There's a photograph that keeps resurfacing whenever people talk about the making of The Lord of the Rings. It shows an elderly man in wizard's robes standing beside a much younger actor in worn leather and chainmail, and neither of them is smiling for the camera. For more than 20 years, the younger man in that photograph said almost nothing in public about what actually happened between them off-camera. Then, well into his 60s, Viggo Mortensen began to talk. Not the usual polite tribute actors give when a colleague has passed, but something slower and more specific, the kind of recollection that only comes from someone who spent years turning experience over in his mind before deciding it was ready to be shared. What took him so long, and what exactly is he describing when he finally does talk about Sir Christopher Lee? To understand why this story matters, it helps to remember just how strange a production of The Lord of the Rings actually was. Peter Jackson made the decision to shoot all 3 films back-to-back in New Zealand, a plan so logistically demanding that actors would perform a scene from the first film in the morning and a scene from the 3rd film that same afternoon. The shoot stretched across more than a year, and the cast did not simply work together. They lived inside a shared world for months at a stretch, forming friendships and rivalries that no ordinary film set produces. Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Sean Bean, Cate Blanchett, Orlando Bloom, and Hugo Weaving were among the actors who became, in effect, a temporary family. Into that family walked Viggo Mortensen, cast so late that he barely had time to pack before flying to New Zealand, and Christopher Lee, a man already in his late 70s who arrived carrying more lived history than perhaps anyone else who has ever stepped onto a fantasy film set. Mortensen's own path to the role of Aragorn was already unusual before he ever met Lee. The part had originally belonged to a different actor, who had spent weeks training and rehearsing before doubts began to surface about his commitment to the physical demands of the role. Reports from production describe a growing frustration on set, culminating in Jackson deciding only days into filming that the arrangement was not working. That left the production searching urgently for a replacement, considering a handful of established names before the opportunity reached Mortensen, an actor known at the time more for smaller character work than for leading a blockbuster trilogy. By several accounts, Mortensen initially hesitated, reluctant to disappear to the other side of the world for months while his young son was growing up. It was reportedly his son's enthusiasm for the books that tipped the decision, and within days Mortensen was on a plane with almost no preparation and no real familiarity with the character he was about to spend years playing. That lack of preparation turned out to shape the performance in ways nobody could have planned. Jackson has spoken about how raw and uncertain Mortensen appears in his earliest scenes, particularly the introduction at the Prancing Pony Inn, and how that uncertainty actually suited a character who spends the story's opening chapters hiding from his own destiny. Rather than smoothing it over, Mortensen leaned into total immersion once he settled in. He trained before sunrise to learn swordsmanship and horseback riding, insisted on fighting with real steel rather than the blunted or synthetic props most productions rely on, and became so devoted to his horse during filming that he purchased the animal once the shoot wrapped. He broke bones during physical stunts and kept working through the pain, and by the production's end, colleagues and crew members were reportedly calling him by his character's name even in casual. Before that crossing, researchers had spent years building models of what interstellar space should look like. Those models predicted something close to a whisper of a place. Thin, cold, mostly empty, with particles drifting quietly and almost nothing happening. It was supposed to be one of the calmest environments in the known universe. Reality had other plans. Starting in 2017, Voyager 1's plasma wave instrument began picking up something researchers did not expect at all. A faint, steady signal moving through the interstellar plasma, not appearing briefly and vanishing, but persisting year after year. Scientists eventually determined that this signal stretched across more than 900 million miles of space, a scale that dwarfs the distance between Earth and the Sun by roughly 10 times over. This was published in the journal Nature Astronomy, and it forced a rethink. Interstellar space, it turned out, was not the silent, empty stretch many had imagined. It was active. It had structure and movement across enormous distances, patterns that had stayed completely hidden until a spacecraft finally sat inside that environment and listened. For the first time in history, scientists were not relying purely on telescopes pointed outward from Earth or mathematical simulations run on supercomputers. They had a witness on the scene, sending back a live account of conditions that had only ever existed as theory before. But Voyager 1's story is not only about discovery, it is also about survival. And in 2023, that survival was tested in a way that frightened the very engineers who know the spacecraft best. For 5 months, Voyager 1 kept sending its radio signal exactly on schedule, proof that the spacecraft itself was alive and functioning. The problem was that the information inside that signal made no sense. It was garbled, scrambled, unreadable, as if the spacecraft were trying to speak, but the words kept coming out broken. The team at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory had studied every transmission Voyager 1 had ever sent since 1977, and this was unlike anything in that history. Eventually, after painstaking investigation, they traced the fault to a single memory chip inside the spacecraft's flight data system. Decades of exposure to cosmic radiation had slowly worn it down until it simply failed, corrupting the science data before it ever left the spacecraft. There was no warning light, no alarm, just a piece of 46-year-old hardware finally giving out after operating nonstop in one of the most punishing environments a machine can experience. On Earth, a broken chip is often a quick fix. Out there, roughly 15 billion miles from home, there was no repair crew to send. The only tool available was radio communication, and even that carried a brutal cost. A message sent from Earth took about 22 hours just to reach the spacecraft. If Voyager 1 replied immediately, that answer needed another 22 hours to come back. Every single test the engineers wanted to try required waiting roughly 44 hours before they could even see whether it had worked. Imagine trying to fix something you cannot see, using instructions that take almost 2 full days to get a response. That was a reality facing the team. They would study the corrupted data, form a hypothesis, write careful instructions, send them across the dark, and then simply wait. One mistake, sent across billions of miles with no way to intervene, once it left Earth, could have conversation. Sword trainers on the film have praised his skill in interviews, describing him as one of the most committed students they worked with during their careers on the trilogy. Christopher Lee's approach to the same production could not have looked more different on the surface, and that contrast is precisely what seems to have stayed with Mortensen the longest. Lee did not need weeks of immersive preparation, because he had already spent more than 50 years as a working actor by the time filming began, along with a life outside the film industry that very few performers could claim. Born in London in 1922 to an Italian mother and a British Army officer father, Lee grew up with connections that placed him near extraordinary company from an early age, including a family relationship that eventually linked him to novelist Ian Fleming. When the Second World War arrived, Lee served with the Royal Air Force, and although a medical issue with his eyesight kept him from becoming a pilot, he was assigned to intelligence work instead. His fluency in several languages made him valuable in that role. An account of his service described time spent in North Africa alongside reconnaissance units, as well as later work helping to locate individuals wanted for war crimes. Lee rarely elaborated on the details of that period publicly during his lifetime, and some of the specifics have been debated by historians and biographers. But what is broadly agreed upon is that he came out of the war having witnessed real violence and real human suffering on a scale that most actors, then or now, never encounter. That experience appears to have shaped how Lee approached playing villains for the rest of his career. In interviews given later in his life, he explained that he never saw the monsters and antagonists he portrayed as simply evil, but instead felt something closer to sympathy for them, sensing that many of them had not set out to become what they turned into. It is a strikingly humane way to describe a career built largely on menace, and it points to why his performances carried a weight that pure technique alone rarely produces. This is a quality Mortensen has pointed to when trying to explain what set Lee apart on set. Technical skill can be taught and rehearsed, but the particular stillness and gravity Lee brought to Saruman, especially in his voice, came from somewhere technique cannot reach. Jackson himself has said that Lee's commanding voice and decades of screen villainy were central to why the role worked as well as it did, and why he wanted Lee specifically rather than simply casting a capable actor from that generation. One moment from the production has become a small piece of set legend precisely because it illustrates this so clearly. While filming the sequence in which Saruman meets his end, Jackson began offering Lee direction on how to react physically to being stabbed. According to widely repeated accounts from people involved with production, Lee stopped him, noting that he understood exactly how a man reacts to being stabbed in the back because he had witnessed it firsthand during his wartime service. The set reportedly went quiet, and Jackson let him play the moment his own way. Whether or not every detail of that exchange has been preserved with perfect accuracy after so many retellings, it captures something true about the atmosphere Lee brought with him. A sense that he had access to a category of experience no one else on set could match, and everyone around him seemed to recognize it. Lee's life outside the war was just as unusual. He had wanted to play Gandalf, a role he had dreamed about since first reading Tolkien decades earlier, and he acknowledged that his age made the physical demands of that part impractical. Rather than treat Saruman as a consolation, approached it with the same seriousness he brought to every role across a career that eventually spanned more than 200 films. From his string of performances as Dracula in the Hammer horror productions, to a Bond villain in The Man with the Golden Gun, to Count Dooku in the Star Wars prequels. He was, by his own account, the only person connected to Jackson's films who had actually met J.R.R. Tolkien in person, having crossed paths with the author at an Oxford pub decades earlier, and he made a habit of rereading the books annually for years afterward. Despite the commercial success of his monster and villain roles, Lee often said that the performance he was proudest of was his portrayal of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, founder of Pakistan, in a 1998 biographical film, a role that demanded a very different kind of emotional precision than anything horror cinema had asked of him. Watching all of this up close gave Mortensen something to study that had little to do with line readings or blocking. He has spoken over the years about believing that real presence on screen comes less from technique and more from what an actor has actually lived through, a philosophy that lines up neatly with what he witnessed in Lee. Where Mortensen's own method involved total immersion, arriving early to train and staying in character between takes, Lee's method was almost the opposite. Decades of accumulated instinct that no longer needed conscious preparation because it had become inseparable from how he simply carried himself. Mortensen has described the difference between competence and genuine truthfulness in performance, and it is not hard to see why watching Lee work would have crystallized that idea for him. A performer who has witnessed real consequence in life brings something to a small gesture or a moment of stillness that cannot be manufactured through rehearsal alone. There was also a shared stubbornness between the two men that seems to have deepened the connection. Even though their characters were adversaries on screen, Lee spent years pushing back against being typecast after his run of horror films, eventually relocating to the United States in search of more varied work rather than settling into comfortable repetition. Mortensen, for his part, has spent much of his career choosing smaller, more difficult projects over conventional star vehicles. And in 2002, he founded his own publishing company specifically to support creative work that might otherwise go unnoticed. Both men, in their own ways, resisted the industry's tendency to reward image management over substance, and it is easy to imagine why Mortensen would have recognized and respected that quality in an actor more than 3 decades a senior. Christopher Lee passed away in June 2015 at a hospital in London at the age of 93, and news of his death was held back for several days at his family's request so that relatives could be told privately before the public announcement. He left behind one of the most unusual filmographies in the history of British cinema, along with honors that include a knighthood and fellowships from both BAFTA and the British Film Institute. Recognition that had often been slow to arrive during the years when horror typecasting limited how seriously critics engaged with his work. Even in his late 80s and early 90s, he continued surprising audiences, releasing symphonic metal concept albums about Charlemagne and, through a heavy metal cover of a Christmas song, becoming the oldest living performer ever to chart on the Billboard Hot 100. It was years after Lee's death, and roughly 2 decades after the trilogy wrapped, that Mortensen began speaking more openly and at greater length about what he had actually observed during their time together in New Zealand. That gap makes a certain kind of sense. Some influences take time to fully understand, especially when the person who shaped them is no longer there to discuss it further. By the time Mortensen reached his own 60s, having continued building a career defined by exactly the kind of serious, uncompromising choices that Lee modeled decades earlier, he had a perspective to describe not just what Lee did on set, but why it mattered. What he ultimately offers is not gossip or a collection of anecdotes designed to entertain, but an argument about what it actually means for a life fully lived to translate into a performance, and why an actor who witnessed genuine consequence firsthand can bring something to a role that no amount of preparation ever fully replicates. That is, in the end, the quiet thread running through everything Mortensen has said about Christopher Lee. Two performers from wildly different generations and wildly different personal histories, working side by side on a fantasy epic, recognized something in each other that had nothing to do with special effects or box office numbers. It had to do with the belief that the work only means something if it is done honestly, all the way through, regardless of who is watching or how large the role happens to be. Lee demonstrated that belief across more than half a century of films, wars, and reinventions long before Mortensen ever met him. And in choosing so many years later to finally put that observation into words, Mortensen made sure it would not simply disappear along with the man who inspired it.